You know what keeps me up at night? It's not the economy crashing tomorrow or some dramatic headline. It's watching my own parents, people who did everything right, slowly realize their retirement plan was built on quicksand. And they're not alone. Right now, 79% of Americans between 62 and 70 don't have enough money to actually retire. That's not a fringe statistic. That's nearly 4 out of 5 people. If you found value in what I'm about to share, hit that like button and subscribe, because understanding this crisis might be the difference between preparing for reality and getting blindsided by it. This isn't about people being lazy or financially reckless. This is about a fundamental breakdown in the system we were all told to trust. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why retirement as we knew it is vanishing, why it's affecting every single generation differently, and most importantly, what this actually means for your future. Because ignoring this won't make it go away. It'll just make the landing harder when reality hits. The promise that died quietly. For decades, there was a simple contract that defined American adulthood. You worked hard, you stayed loyal to your employer, and in return, you got to retire with dignity. It wasn't complicated. There was usually a pension waiting for you, Social Security as your backup, and if you managed your money reasonably well, your house would be paid off by the time you hung up your work. The beauty of this system was its simplicity. You didn't need to be a Wall Street genius or spend your weekends studying investment strategies. You just needed to show up consistently, do your job, and avoid major mistakes. The infrastructure handled the rest. Your employer manages your pension. The government backed Social Security. Your home equity grew steadily. Retirement wasn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It was the natural endpoint of a working life. But here's what most people still haven't fully grasped. That entire structure has been systematically dismantled. Over the past 4 decades, pensions have virtually disappeared from private sector jobs. They've been replaced by 401 accounts, which sound similar but represent a radical shift in responsibility. Suddenly, you're not just expected to work, you're expected to become your own financial planner, investment manager, and risk analyst, all while working full-time. Job stability collapsed at the same time. The days of spending 30 years at one company are gone. Now, people restart their careers every few years, often not by choice. And every restart means lost momentum and savings, lost employer matches, sometimes lost retirement accounts altogether because you didn't understand the rollover process or couldn't afford to keep contributing during a gap. Social Security was always meant to be supplemental income, maybe covering 40% of your expenses if you were lucky. But as pensions vanished and personal savings failed to keep pace, more and more people began treating it as their primary retirement plan. The problem? It was never designed to carry that weight. It's like using a life jacket as a boat. It'll keep you afloat temporarily, but it was never built to get you where you need to go. What we're living through isn't just a tough period that will pass. It's the permanent end of a system that traded lifetime loyalty for lifetime security. And the people who built their plans around that old promise are now discovering it was revoked without notice. The shocking truth about retirement savings. Let's talk about numbers that should terrify you. The median retirement savings for all working-age households in America is $3,000. Not $300,000, not $30,000. $3,000. That's barely enough to cover a few months of basic expenses, let alone decades of retirement. Even for people aged 55 to 64, those standing right at retirement's doorstep, the median balance is only $185,000. And while that sounds more substantial, consider this. Experts now estimate you need between $1.26 million and $1.28 million for a comfortable retirement in 2025. The gap between where people are and where they need to be isn't just large, it's catastrophic. But it gets worse. Roughly 40% to 46% of American adults have exactly $0 saved for retirement. Not a small amount, not less than they'd like. Absolutely nothing. They're approaching the end of their working lives with the same retirement preparation they had at 22. Part of this crisis stems from simple access. Nearly half of full-time workers, 42%, don't have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. For part-time workers, that number jumps to 79%. If you're cobbling together gig work, contract positions, or part-time jobs just to survive, you're essentially locked out of the primary vehicle most people use to save for retirement. Think about what this means in practical terms. Millions of people are working their entire adult lives without ever getting the chance to participate in the system they're told will save them. They're not avoiding 401 because they're irresponsible. They literally don't have the option. And when your employer doesn't offer a plan, setting up your own IRA and contributing to it consistently while managing all of life's other expenses becomes exponentially harder. This is why the retirement crisis isn't just affecting the careless or the unlucky. It's becoming the default outcome for anyone who doesn't have consistent access to well-paying jobs with strong benefits. And that's an increasingly large portion of the American workforce. When your safety net has holes for millions of Americans, Social Security has transformed from a supplemental benefit into their entire retirement strategy. Ask people nearing retirement what their plan is, and you'll hear the same answer over and over. We'll make it work with Social Security. The problem is that Social Security was never built for this. It was designed to replace roughly 40% of your pre-retirement income. The average monthly benefit right now is between $1,700 and $1,900. That might cover your groceries and utilities if you're careful, but it won't cover housing, healthcare, transportation, and everything else you need to actually live for potentially 2 or 3 decades after you stop working. What makes this situation genuinely frightening is what's coming. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to run out of money by 2033. That's less than a decade away. When that happens, if Congress doesn't intervene, benefits will be automatically cut by approximately 23% to 24%. Let that sink in. The system that tens of millions of people are counting on as their only retirement income could see a quarter of its payouts disappear in just 8 years. And this isn't speculation or fear-mongering. These are the official projections from the Social Security Administration itself. Now, Social Security won't disappear entirely. The program will still collect payroll taxes and distribute them, but the checks will be smaller. And for people already struggling to survive on $1,800 a month, losing another $400 to $450 could be the difference between barely making it and complete financial collapse. The real tragedy here isn't that Social Security is failing. It's that everything else failed first. Pensions disappeared. Personal savings didn't materialize. Wages stagnated while costs exploded. And Social Security, which was always meant to be one leg of a 3-legged stool, is now expected to be the entire chair. When it inevitably can't support that weight, millions of people won't have anywhere soft to land. The silent killer, inflation, and healthcare. If there's one force quietly destroying retirement plans without making dramatic headlines, it's inflation. Not the kind that causes market crashes overnight, but the slow, relentless kind that makes everything cost just a little more, year after year, until a little more becomes unaffordable. 30 years ago, reaching $1 million meant you'd made it. You were set. Today, that same million doesn't carry nearly the same weight. Groceries cost more, housing costs more, insurance, utilities, transportation, everything climbs steadily higher. What once felt like a massive financial cushion is now just enough to stay comfortable for maybe a decade or two if you're lucky and careful. This is why retirees who thought they planned well often find themselves watching their savings evaporate. It's not always because they spent recklessly. Often, it's because they kept their money in safe places, savings accounts, CDs, low-yield bonds, that couldn't keep pace with inflation. You end up with roughly the same number on your statement, but what that number can actually buy has been cut in half. Here's the cruel irony. Avoiding risk becomes its own form of risk. But taking risk isn't straightforward either. Markets are volatile, and when you're 68 years old living off your portfolio, you don't have the luxury of waiting 15 years for the market to recover from a crash. One bad downturn at the wrong time can permanently damage your financial security. Now let's talk about the expense that catches everyone off guard. Healthcare. Even with Medicare, healthcare in retirement is far from free. A typical couple will face healthcare costs exceeding $345,000 over the course of their retirement. That's premiums, deductibles, co-pays, prescriptions, and all the services Medicare doesn't fully cover. And that figure doesn't include long-term care. Medicare doesn't cover extended nursing home stays or assisted living facilities. Those costs can easily run $5,000 to $10,000 per month, and they don't announce themselves politely. One fall, one diagnosis, one gradual decline in mobility, and your stable retirement can turn into a financial emergency almost overnight. What makes healthcare costs especially destructive is their timing. They tend to spike precisely when your ability to earn more income has disappeared. You can't work extra hours to compensate. You can't switch to a higher-paying career. You're drawing from savings that were supposed to last decades, and one prolonged medical issue can drain them far faster than you ever anticipated. This is why so many retirement plans collapse, not because of poor spending habits, but because of bad luck. And in retirement, there's no such thing as recovering from bad luck. The housing foundation has cracked for earlier generations. Housing was the cornerstone of retirement security. By the time people stopped working, their homes were paid off. Monthly expenses dropped dramatically. Shelter became predictable. That stability made everything else, Social Security, modest savings, even part-time work, stretch much further. That foundation no longer exists for most people. Today, far more Americans are approaching retirement still carrying mortgages well into their 60s. Some never bought homes at all and are lifelong renters, exposed to rent increases that don't care about fixed incomes. And even those who technically own their homes aren't living expense-free. Property taxes rise, insurance premiums climb. Maintenance costs don't disappear with age. They usually increase. For millennials and Gen Z, this problem is exponentially worse. Many were priced out of home ownership during their prime earning years. Home prices exploded while wages stagnated, making the down payment alone feel like an impossible barrier. Others stretched themselves dangerously thin just to get in the door, locking themselves into 30-year mortgages that will collide directly with their retirement timelines. Housing, once the great stabilizer, has become yet another variable, another source of anxiety. The danger is subtle but severe. Housing costs don't politely adjust to retirement budgets. They keep rising while your income becomes fixed. A paid-off home used to act as a buffer against inflation. Renting or carrying debt turns inflation into a constant compounding threat. This is why stories of older adults taking on roommates or moving into shared living arrangements are becoming more common. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's a financial adaptation, and it's a clear signal that the traditional housing retirement equation has fundamentally broken down. Each generation faces a worse reality. One of the most uncomfortable truths about the retirement crisis is that it isn't distributed evenly. Each generation has entered adulthood under vastly different conditions, and with every shift, the odds have quietly gotten worse. Baby boomers had it relatively clear. Wages rose alongside productivity. Housing was affordable relative to income. Employer pensions were still common, and staying with one company for decades wasn't unusual. Retirement, while never guaranteed, felt achievable if you followed the basic rules. Work hard, save what you can, and things would probably work out. Gen X arrived at a turning point. They were told the same story, but the ground was already shifting beneath them. Pensions faded just as they hit their prime earning years. Job security weakened. Many were hit by multiple recessions, layoffs, and career disruptions that forced them to restart repeatedly. A staggering 75% of households aged 55 to 65 now have almost no realistic chance of funding their retirement needs. They did everything right according to the old playbook, but the game had already changed. Millennials stepped into an even harsher reality. Home prices exploded beyond any reasonable relationship to wages. Student loan debt became a defining feature of early adulthood, with 2.8 million Americans over 60 still carrying student loans. Stable long-term employment became the exception rather than the norm. For many millennials, retirement stopped feeling like a destination and started feeling like a fantasy, something abstract, distant, and possibly unattainable. Gen Z is watching all of this unfold in real time. They're entering a labor market marked by instability, automation anxiety, housing costs at historic highs, and inflation eating away at wages from day one. Instead of inheriting optimism, they're inheriting warnings. 70% of Gen Z is worried about having to reduce spending due to inflation and housing costs. Many aren't asking how to retire comfortably, they're asking whether retirement will exist at all by the time they reach 65. This is why the retirement crisis feels so pervasive. It's not just that individuals are struggling, it's that each generation is starting from a weaker position than the one before it. The system isn't correcting itself, it's accelerating in the wrong direction. The $3 million trap in recent years, a number has started circulating that stops people cold. $3 million. Some experts now estimate that's what you need to retire comfortably at 65. For most people, hearing that figure feels less like financial guidance and more like being told you've already lost. On the surface, the math is brutal. If you work for 45 years, reaching $3 million means saving the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars annually. Most people don't have that kind of excess income, especially while juggling mortgages, healthcare, family responsibilities, and the rising cost of simply existing. To make this seem more achievable, the conversation usually pivots to investing. You don't need to save every dollar, the logic goes. Let compound growth do the heavy lifting. With average market returns, you only need to contribute a few $100s per month. On paper, it sounds manageable. In reality, it's built on assumptions most people can't meet. Those projections assume uninterrupted careers with consistent contributions over decades. They assume favorable market conditions. They assume no prolonged layoffs, no health crises, no caregiving responsibilities, and no periods where survival takes priority over saving. For millions of workers, those assumptions are fantasy. The danger of the $3 million figure isn't that it's high, it's that it creates paralysis. People look at the gap between where they are and where they're supposed to be, and they quietly give up. If you're 40 years old with $15,000 saved, being told you need $3 million doesn't motivate you. It convinces you that you've already failed, so why bother continuing to try? This is the psychological trap that's doing as much damage as the financial reality. When the goal feels impossible, people stop working toward it entirely. And that surrender, more than anything else, guarantees the outcome everyone fears. When just invest isn't enough for years, the go-to advice has been remarkably simple. Just invest. Put your money in the market, stay consistent, and over time, everything will work out. For earlier generations, that advice often held true. Long-term growth smoothed out downturns. Patience was rewarded. But today, that reassurance doesn't land the same way. Younger workers understand the logic of investing. They're not financially illiterate. What they're uneasy about is the landscape they're being asked to trust. Major stock indices are heavily concentrated in a handful of technology companies. Entire market rallies are driven by narratives, artificial intelligence, automation, speculative growth that feel more fragile than foundation. When gains depend on momentum and hype rather than broad economic strength, confidence becomes harder to maintain. Then there's the timing problem that rarely gets discussed openly. Investing works best when you have time. But retirement doesn't give you unlimited runway. If you experience a significant market downturn early in your retirement, it can permanently damage your portfolio, a phenomenon known as sequence of returns risk. Even if the market fully recovers years later, the damage may already be irreversible because you were forced to withdraw funds at the worst possible time. This is why telling people to just invest often feels dismissive. It ignores the psychological reality of volatility and the structural reality that many workers don't have decades of uninterrupted growth ahead of them. Investing remains necessary, but it no longer feels like a guarantee. The fear isn't that markets will fail forever, it's that the margin for error has become painfully thin, and one bad stretch at the wrong moment can undo a lifetime of careful effort. The psychology of giving up as the idea of stable retirement drifts further out of reach. A subtle but powerful psychological shift has taken hold, especially among younger generations. If the future feels uncertain or unattainable, the incentive to sacrifice today weakens dramatically. This is where doom spending enters the picture. Doom spending isn't traditional irresponsibility. It's a coping mechanism. When people believe that saving diligently still won't lead to security, spending becomes a way to reclaim control in the present. Experiences, convenience, small luxuries. They start to feel justified not because they're affordable, but because tomorrow feels unreliable. Social media amplifies this loop relentlessly. Endless streams of curated lifestyles, travel, luxury, soft life narratives blur the line between aspiration and expectation. Credit cards fill the gap between income and desire. Small monthly payments feel manageable until they quietly accumulate into long-term financial constraints that become nearly impossible to escape. What makes this feedback loop so dangerous is that it reinforces itself. The more people spend to escape financial anxiety, the less margin they have. The less margin they have, the more hopeless retirement planning feels. And the more hopeless it feels, the easier it becomes to justify spending even more. This isn't moral failure. It's a rational response to a system that feels rigged against long-term discipline. But rational or not, the outcome is the same. Doom spending doesn't just delay retirement, it actively accelerates the conditions that make retirement impossible. The tragedy is that many people recognize this pattern while feeling powerless to escape it. They know the math, they understand the consequences. What they don't see is a future that feels worth sacrificing for. And that might be the most alarming signal of all, redefining what retirement actually means. At some point, the conversation around retirement has to shift from what it used to be to what it's realistically becoming. For most people, retirement will no longer mean a clean break from work. It won't look like decades of leisure funded by a single nest egg. Instead, it's evolving into something far more fluid and uncertain. The emerging reality is that retirement is less about stopping work entirely and more about reducing financial pressure. It's about flexibility rather than freedom. Part-time income, consulting work, remote positions, project-based roles. These are becoming core components of how people expect to survive their later years. Not because they love the idea of working into their 70s, but because full financial independence feels increasingly out of reach. This shift isn't inherently negative, but it is a fundamental departure from the promise that defined earlier generations. The danger lies in pretending the old model still applies. When expectations don't match reality, people plan poorly, delay hard decisions, and underestimate the runway they'll actually need. The uncomfortable truth is that the future of retirement will demand adaptability. Those who can pivot, adjust expectations, downsize deliberately, and build flexibility into their lives will fare better than those clinging to a version of retirement that no longer exists for most people. It's not about giving up on comfort or security. It's about redefining those concepts before circumstances force the redefinition on you. The path forward. The retirement crisis in America didn't happen by accident. It's the result of rising costs, shifting all risk onto individuals, unstable careers, and a system that no longer functions the way people were promised it would. Inflation, healthcare expenses, housing instability, and market uncertainty have transformed retirement into something far more fragile and precarious than most people realize. This isn't about spreading fear, it's about building awareness. Pretending the old model still applies only delays hard decisions and reduces your future options. Understanding why most people will never retire the way previous generations did is the essential first step toward adapting your own strategy. The generations entering the workforce today won't have pensions waiting for them. Social Security might exist in some diminished form, but it won't be enough. Housing costs won't magically become affordable. Healthcare expenses will keep rising. The only variable you can actually control is how you respond to these realities. If this breakdown gave you the clarity you needed to start thinking differently about your future, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because going forward, the future will reward preparation and adaptation, not denial and hope. The retirement crisis is real, it's accelerating, and understanding it now gives you the only advantage that matters: time to adjust before it's too late.